The fourth Sunday after Easter is always the Good Shepherd Sunday. And so the 23rd Psalm is always used, and we always read portions of John chapter 10. During this year also, instead of having Hebrew Bible readings included as part of the regular schedule, instead we have readings from the book of Acts. And while we are surrounded by sheep, it is primarily this story that I want to talk about today. There's a city here, it's called Joppa. Joppa is what we would call today Tel Aviv. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas, which in English is gazelle. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, who heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with this request: "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All of the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. So you saw in the video, and you heard from Dr. Williams a little earlier in the service, that the passage from John 10 is essentially practically true. Sheep develop a knowledge of their shepherd's voice, and they are more likely to respond by far to their shepherd's voice than to any other. In fact, it would be dangerous for a sheep to follow some other voice, especially if it was a very smart talking wolf. Humans also have a tremendous affinity to hearing voices. And I'm not talking about language here per se, I'm talking about the sound and the tone and the range of a voice. We know that infants hear in the womb, and they hear their family members, and they hear primarily their mothers. We know for sure that in the last 10 weeks or so of pregnancy, a human infant responds differently and wakes up and gets excited and turns its head in the womb if its mother is speaking. And even after a child is born, that early development and attunement to language is so important. I have a niece who was born in Korea. It was known from the time she was born and placed with a foster family that she would be adopted by an American family. And so to prepare her for that, starting at 1 day of age, her Korean family spoke to her in both English and Korean, to make sure that she heard the sounds and the tones of English, that would be familiar to her when she met her forever family. We have a deep instinctual response to certain kinds of tones of language. There's a reason why Alexa starts out with a female voice. You can change it, but there's a reason why Siri on Apple products starts out with a female voice. You can change it. That has to do with research that's shown that both men and women are more likely to be attentive to a woman's voice than a man's voice. That was discovered because of airline pilots and crashes. You know those voice recorder things? One of the things they learned by analyzing crashes some 20, 30 years ago is that pilots would hear the warning voice that would say, "You're about to hit a mountain, pull up." And they'd hear that voice, and it would be a big manly voice, because that's what the designers thought would be effective, was a big manly voice. And when the big manly voice came over to the intercom and you could hear it on the flight data recorder, the pilots didn't even hear it. Didn't even register. It was just part of the noise of the room, went right over their heads. And as soon as they changed that voice to a more lighter, more female, higher tone, all of a sudden it was noticed. Now, partly that's probably because there weren't enough women in cockpits at the time, but still, they did note that we are more likely to tune to a female voice initially than to a male one. And that makes sense. On the other hand, you see an infant when its father or grandfather shows up and they speak in a normal tone of voice and not the voice like mom speaks. And the baby starts to kick their legs and get all excited because they recognize the change. They know that that's a different person. And in a lot of cases, they're about to have a more playful experience. And so they engage and go to that place. My oldest child, for sure, was sensitive to sound and voices. He's a musician now. It all kind of falls into place. When I was pregnant with him, I was working an evening shift in a factory. And I was the only employee that worked evenings. Basically, they gave me a special dispensation to come in by myself. They thought I was reliable. And I was making suits for race car drivers, and I was making them on a great, big, huge industrial sewing machine. So I wasn't speaking because there was nobody to talk to. And my husband was working nights, and he was sleeping days, and so I didn't get to talk to him very much, right? And so there wasn't a lot of speech going on, but there was a lot of and that was the motor of the industrial sewing machine right here next to my belly. And my son was born, and he eventually seemed to know my voice and to know his father's voice, and just always seemed a little bit like a lost lamb in the world until the day he was at Grandma Bev's house. Grandma Bev, the maniacally clean. Grandma Bev with the Electrolux vacuum cleaner. Grandma Bev turns on her big, mighty vacuum cleaner. And Jonathan goes, oh, like, Mama. And I knew then that I had been replaced by a vacuum cleaner. And I'm not joking about this. He was so invested in that vacuum cleaner that when she had him over, which she did every day, he would go as soon as he could crawl and knock on the door, and the vacuum cleaner had to be taken out and placed in the living room so he could be close to it. And we also had to use Electrolux, and we had to take ours out as well and leave it in the middle of the room. We never used it, but we would leave it in the middle of the room to be a comfort to our poor child who didn't know his mother's voice. Yeah, he'd do the sound. He would hold it and go, like it was his first language, yeah. Yeah, messed me up. Okay, just kidding. So, those of us who are moms, and those of us who have moms, we know that our moms have more than one voice, right? Right? Your mom has more than one voice. So, I mean, don't go too crazy with this, but I think at lunch today, you should have a little fun family discussion about the different voices of your mom. My mom had a contented voice, and it sounded like hymns while she was singing, while she was doing the dishes. Where he follows, I will lead him. And she'd sing all kinds of crazy things. But she would make up words and be goofy, but they were always hymn tunes, and she was constantly singing when she was happy and when she was content. My mother also has a disciplined voice. Most mothers have a disciplined voice. My mother's disciplined voice is so effective that I swear the sheep would have come tearing across that field. There is not a dog in the universe that does not roll over, sit, and stay as soon as my mother speaks. It's just a great disciplined voice. She had the shepherd kind of voice for her kids because, you know, kids used to run all over the neighborhood without being close to the house, and she'd come out and she'd go, Peter, James, John. She never had to call me. I was always in the corner reading a book. But she had a shepherd voice. Everybody in the neighborhood had a shepherd voice, except for the Johnsons. The Johnsons were a Roman Catholic family. They had 13 children, and she had a bell. She had a big ding, ding, ding. So it was a way of calling, a way of bringing people back together. The scariest voice my mother had was the laundry chute voice of doom. We lived in a two-story house, big parsonage with a full basement, and all throughout that was a tube big enough to drop your little sister down. I know that from experience. This laundry chute, which would never be put anywhere now because it'd be considered way too dangerous, straight through the house. And if my mother was downstairs, which she often was because she ironed everything, she would be downstairs, and if the phone rang or she needed something, she would open up the laundry chute, put her hand up inside, bang it, and start yelling up the laundry chute for whatever it was she wanted, and it would reverberate all throughout the house, and it was terrifying. And we would all run immediately and do what she said. I have mother voices, of course. I am a mother. I have a happy, random singing voice that primarily irritates my children. That's why I like it. I have a disciplined voice, definitely. And on occasion, a dog may or may not sit and stay if I use my disciplined voice. It's not nearly as good as my mom's. I have a tired voice, the I can't talk to you now, I have to go take a nap voice that my kids recognize. I have a church voice. Now, you know my church voice, but my kids know my church voice like this. Beloved, we are gathered here today, and I'm busy, and I'm not your mother. Go find your father. Right? Because it's not a time to be interrupted, and they had to learn that. There are voices I am not proud of. There's the driver's education voice. That was not... had a whole different vocabulary. It was really kind of interesting. I did rarely, but I did have a I'm so angry my vocal cords may never recover voice. And I have a voice, my husband will attest to this, where I can say, what do you want? But I can say it in such a way that I'm making it perfectly clear that you better not ask me for anything. What do you want? Oh, nothing, honey, nothing. Nothing at all. I know, as I look back on my 30 years of having kids in our household, that way more than I would ever want to admit, that mother's voice was filled with judgment or anger, often disappointment. I regret that much more than the words themselves. I regret that sense of tone in our home. Those times when nothing and no one is good enough. Every family has traumas like this. They might not be that particular one, but every family has voices they wish they'd never used. Every family has stories they would never want to tell a stranger. Every family has its own struggle. I think it's interesting that while we have songs and poems and things about seeing things with God's eyes, and we have bracelets and bumper stickers that tell us to do what Jesus would do, we don't say, speak with the voice of God. Well, that's because that sounds like blasphemy. But what I'm talking about is not pretending you are God. If someone looks with God's eyes, they're looking with mercy and compassion. If someone is doing the work of Jesus, they are doing good, and they are helping those who are most left out of whatever situation they find themselves in. So the voice of Jesus in us could be any language, any number of words or no words at all, but it's a tone. It is a soothing and a welcome and a calming, and it doesn't bring any more anxiety into a situation. It simply listens and responds and cares. It's a tone of voice. It's a tone of mind, if there is such a thing. That's what I would really like to work on as a mother, as a wife, having Jesus' voice in terms of that tone and welcome. In our readings today, voices are incredibly powerful. We have Peter in the reading part, just before what we read. He goes to a man named Aeneas, who has not gotten out of bed in 8 years, says, "Aeneas, get up," and he stands up and walks. It's exactly like when Jesus had the paralyzed man and his friends brought him into the house on the mat. They had to break through the roof, and Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven, get up and walk," and he does. It's just like that. Peter uses the same words, the same tone, and it works. He talks like Jesus, and it works. The man is healed. And then in the story you did hear, we have Tabitha. I love Tabitha. Someday I'm going to be Tabitha. "I'm sorry, you can't die yet. Your sewing projects aren't finished." That's going to be me. But Tabitha gets called exactly as Jesus called the Roman centurion's daughter when she had died. "Wake up, get up. Tabitha, get up," Peter says. The same tone, the same faith, the same words as Jesus. And what do you know? It works. She wakes from the dead. I'm not really suggesting that you have exactly that degree of power, but I am suggesting that one of the ways God has invested in you, one of the ways God's image is in you, is through your voice. And there is power in what you say and how you say it. Sometimes there's power in what you are willing not to say. And that is the voice of Jesus. So if Jesus used his voice in an authoritative and caring way, and Peter used his voice in an authoritative and caring way, and for the most part, mothers use their voices in an authoritative and caring kind of a way, it just seems to me it makes sense for all the rest of us to do what we can to train our voices in that authoritative and caring way. Not authoritative like, "Let me tell you what to do," but authoritative in terms of, I am confident that I am here for you. I can set aside any anxiety or pain or frustration that I have in this moment because I am loved by Jesus Christ, and because of that security, I can be truly present to you in whatever you are thinking and feeling at this moment. I wish we didn't have a Mother's Day. I'm not very fond of it. You see this beautiful picture here. The mother sheep, her happy little sheepy babies. The next picture is closer to my family. So, like I said, tired voice. I just want to take a nap. I would like for my voice, Mother's Day or any other day, I would like for my voice to speak like God in this sense. Whatever my words, whatever my situation, I would hope that my voice, underneath it all, would always convey, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. I belong to Jesus, and Jesus loves me. And if that is part of the tone of everything we say, you will be astounded at the power and the authority and the care and the healing that does come through the use of your voice. I think we should have a day of reconciliation, maybe, instead of a Mother's Day. But I'm ornery. I'm a sheep. I'm ornery. I think that it's wonderful that families can gather together on this day. And if it's filled with joy for you, I cherish that for you. But remember, as I said before, every family has its trauma. All of us have moments where we said exactly the wrong thing and we will regret it our whole lives. All of us have moments where we've said something and we were so sure we were saying what we meant, but what we meant is not what was heard. All of us have moments where we've desperately wanted to say something to help and we had no idea what to say. All of us have spoken and failed to speak throughout our lives. And in these speeches and these failings to speak to one another, we have wounded and harmed the ones we love the very best. And some of those who love us the very best have wounded and harmed us. Mother's Day doesn't need to be a day of confrontation. It does not need to be a day of pretending to be happy either. It could be a day of compassion. It could be a day of asking your mother some part of her story you've never heard before. It could be a day of thinking, which member of my family most often feels left out or can't be here? And how could we reconnect? You have the voice of Jesus. Never forget, that is a reconciling resurrection voice. Use it. Amen.